In the beginning of the slow and almost unnoticed story of how people in the early lands that would one day form the United States lived, there were no tall glass towers, no rumbling highways, no glowing electric lights, but instead there were homes built out of the most ordinary and humble materials the land itself offered, and these homes were shaped more by necessity than by any grand vision. For the houses of the earliest native peoples stretched from the wigwams of the woodland tribes, simple dome-shaped frames covered with bark or mats, to the longhouses that could shelter entire families with their extended kin, narrow and stretched, yet protective. And in the dry southwest, where rains were scarce and the sun seemed relentless, the Pueblo peoples shaped adobe homes out of mud and straw, stacked in terraces like honeycombs upon cliffsides, each level reached by ladders that were drawn up at night for safety. And among the plains, teepees stood tall, their poles tied at the top and their buffalo hide coverings both shelter from wind and rain and symbols of a way of life that followed the herds. And as one imagines these houses, one can almost feel the slowness of time, the way smoke curled lazily from small fires inside, the way mats and animal skins softened the earth beneath sleeping figures, the way every sound at night was not the hum of machines, but the crackle of a fire, the hoot of an owl, or the distant rush of a river. And as centuries passed and settlers came from Europe, the homes they built were themselves humble and rough, for the first dwellings of the English in Jamestown or the Pilgrims in Plymouth were small wooden huts, with walls of split logs and roofs of thatch scarcely larger than a single modern room. And inside there was only the barest furniture, rough benches, wooden chests, a table, and a bed stuffed with straw, for life was not about comfort, but survival. And slowly, as communities grew, the houses grew sturdier, with clapboard siding, stone chimneys, and small glass windows imported at great cost, while in the South, plantations built larger wooden houses with porches to face the heat, and enslaved people were forced to live in cramped cabins of logs, barely insulated, their lives reflected in the sparseness of the dwellings. And all through these centuries, food, too, was a reflection of simplicity and necessity, for the native peoples had long eaten corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, grown together in mounds where the corn stalks gave support to the beans and the squash spread across the soil to keep it moist, and they gathered berries, hunted deer, and fished rivers, while in the cold north, salmon was dried for the long winters, and in the plains the buffalo gave not only meat, but also hides for shelter and bones for tools. And when the Europeans arrived, they brought wheat and barley, apples and cattle, pigs and chickens, weaving these into diets that slowly blended old and new. And meals were often stews cooked in large iron pots over open hearths, thick bread baked in small ovens, and in the colonies, cider flowed more than water, for it was safer and more reliable, while coffee and tea came slowly, luxuries at first, symbols of connection to distant lands. And work always was steady, slow, and constant. For men in the fields bent their backs from dawn until dusk, women spun flax into linen, churned butter, made soap, and tended gardens. And children fetched water, gathered wood, or learned trades as apprentices. And life was bound not by the ticking of a clock, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the rhythm of need and the patience of survival. And as towns grew, trades flourished, with blacksmiths hammering iron into tools, cobblers shaping shoes, millers grinding grain at the slow turn of a wheel. And each sound was steady, repetitive, almost hypnotic, as if life itself moved in a quiet circle, never rushing, never flashing, always turning at its own pace. And if one walked through a village in the 17th or 18th century, one would see dirt roads lined with small houses, smoke rising slowly, people carrying baskets, livestock wandering nearby, and the overwhelming sense that life was ordinary, repetitive, and calm, not dramatic, not filled with sudden turns, but rather unfolding like a slow, endless narration, where each meal, each chore, each night by the fire was another small sentence in a story with no climax, no conclusion, only the rhythm of living. And as the generations passed, houses became a little larger, sometimes 2 stories with wooden staircases creaking underfoot. Foods became a little more varied with pies and puddings, imported spices like nutmeg and cinnamon making their way into kitchens, but still the core remained humble. Bread and porridge, salted meats and root vegetables, and work remained endless. Farming, weaving, building, mending, always continuing, always stretching into tomorrow. And thus the story of early homes, foods, and labors in America is not one of sudden excitement, but of patient repetition. And as you listen, you may find that the very repetition, the very quietness of their days is like a soft lullaby, carrying you into slumber as the slow tale of ordinary lives, ordinary meals, and ordinary houses continues without end, stretching onward into the next century, the next generation, like the endless rolling plains or the slow-flowing rivers, never rushing, always steady, always calm.
As the 18th century stretched onward into the 19th, the slow transformation of homes, foods, and labors across America unfolded not with sudden sparks of drama, but with the gentle pace of generations. For houses that had once been single rooms of wood or mud began, with time and patience, to expand into larger farmhouses with wide porches where families could sit during humid evenings. And the hearth that once dominated the center of life gave way to more specialized spaces. Kitchens separated from parlors, bedrooms tucked beneath pitched roofs, and furniture growing from rough benches to crafted chairs and bedsteads. All of it still simple, yet slowly more refined. And if one walked through a New England village of the early 1800s, one would find clapboard houses painted white, with green shutters and small gardens, while in the South, wide plantation houses stood with columns and verandas, though behind them stretched rows of cabins where enslaved people lived in cramped spaces, their walls often drafty, their floors of packed dirt, their days defined by unending labor. And across the frontier, as settlers moved westward, homes were log cabins again, hastily raised with neighbors' help, one-room shelters against the wilderness, with chimneys of stone and roofs that leaked when rains were heavy. And inside, life was bare, a table, a bed, a chest, sometimes a rifle above the fireplace, and always the smell of smoke and wood, while food in this same era reflected both tradition and adaptation, with corn still ground into meal for bread, wheat baked into loaves, pork salted and hung to last through winter, beef cured in barrels, and the ever-present stews simmering for hours over slow fires, potatoes and turnips filling bellies more than luxuries ever could, and coffee by now had spread widely, its bitter aroma rising from simple kettles each morning, while tea, once a luxury, was taken more sparingly, and sugar, imported at great cost, sweetened pies and cakes that became special treats, though for many the diet remained humble, porridge in the morning, bread at midday, stew in the evening. And as work stretched on, the rhythms of labor expanded too, for beyond farms and fields, factories began to hum with the slow rise of industry. And though those first machines were powered by water wheels, their clanking filled valleys with new sounds. Yet still, for the ordinary farmer, life was measured by seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, mending tools in winter. And through it all, children worked alongside parents, carrying water, feeding animals, helping at looms, learning by doing. their lives shaped not by books or schools alone, but by the endless cycle of labor that defined survival. And as towns grew, shops appeared. Blacksmiths continued their steady hammering. Carpenters shaped beams. Wheelwrights built carts, and millers ground grain, their wheels turning endlessly, the steady rhythm of wood against water echoing like a heartbeat through communities. And in the evenings, when work was finally done, families gathered by firelight, the dim glow of candles barely bright enough to read by, and the Bible often the only book, its passages recited slowly, or stories told from memory, voices low, rooms filled with the soft creak of chairs, the crackle of fire, and outside the hum of insects or the call of distant animals. All of it a world so slow, so steady, that it seems to stretch into timelessness. And even as transportation shifted, with horses pulling wagons along rutted dirt roads, ferries crossing rivers, and by the early 1800s, canals and steamboats beginning to shorten distances, the lives of most remained bound to the soil, to the quiet routine of work and rest. And when railroads came, with their whistles and their speed, they brought new goods, new foods, new furniture. Yet even so, the average home remained humble, with its wooden floorboards creaking, its pantry filled with jars of pickled vegetables, sacks of flour, barrels of salt pork, and the slow, repetitive tasks of churning butter, weaving cloth, patching garments, and tending animals remained unchanged. For life at its core was about sustaining the ordinary. And thus, as the 19th century grew busier with towns and industry, the texture of daily existence still whispered the same quiet refrain. Houses that sheltered, foods that filled, work that never ended, days that blurred softly into one another, weeks, months, years flowing like a river whose current was steady but never rushed, carrying families forward in silence, in patience, in the quiet monotony that soothed and sustained. And as you listen, you may feel how their slowness itself becomes a rhythm, a lull, a gentle tide that drifts ever onward without sudden storms, without sharp turns, but always steady, always calm, always the same.
As the 19th century moved steadily toward its latter decades, the character of homes, foods, and labors in America shifted once more, not with the sudden clang of history's battles, but with the slow persistence of daily adaptation. For while in the countryside, many houses still remained wooden farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys, in towns and cities, brick row houses began to line narrow streets, their facades plain, their interiors dimly lit by oil lamps. And within these spaces, families arranged parlors with stiff furniture, heavy drapes, and shelves that now, little by little, carried more than the Bible. For newspapers, magazines, and novels grew cheaper with the rise of printing. Yet even so, most evenings still gathered around the same hearth, where coal replaced wood, where stoves replaced open fires, where kettles and pots still simmered slowly, filling rooms with the smell of cabbage, bread, and stews that never hurried. And food itself, while touched by greater variety, as railroads brought oranges from Florida, beef from the West, or canned goods from factories, still remained ordinary for the majority. Bread baked weekly, salted meat stretched carefully, potatoes and beans filling the largest share of plates, while in immigrant neighborhoods, flavors of Italy, Ireland, Germany, and later Eastern Europe began to mingle, their kitchens filled with the smell of garlic, sausages, dumplings, all carried quietly into the American mix, though still in small local ways, while work, perhaps more than anything, grew heavier, for factories demanded long hours in air thick with smoke and dust, where men, women, and even children tended machines that rattled and hummed without pause. Yet outside those factory walls, work on farms remained endless, dawn to dusk, mending fences, plowing fields, milking cows, harvesting hay. And still the rhythm of hands weaving cloth, mending boots, stirring laundry and steaming tubs continued as it always had. And in the cities, work multiplied into trades, bakers rising before dawn, cobblers hammering at leather, seamstresses bending over cloth, dock workers hauling crates, all steady, all repetitive, all without drama, simply the unending texture of life. And homes, as populations swelled, often became crowded, tenements rising with narrow staircases, rooms shared by families, walls damp, air close, windows small. Yet still, inside those walls, life carried on. Meals cooked, babies rocked, conversations whispered, candles burned low. While outside, the city dark but restless, its alleys echoing with footsteps, its factories glowing with night fires. Yet all within the slow, inevitable current of time. For nothing in this telling is rushed, nothing is heightened, nothing is more than the soft layering of one day upon another, years flowing onward with the same steady murmur. Houses built, repaired, sometimes abandoned. Meals cooked, shared, sometimes missed. Work begun, endured, sometimes lost. All of it blending into a quiet panorama of ordinary existence, where the drama is not in battles or speeches, but in the silent persistence of human life, carrying forward through smoke, through soot, through hunger and effort, always steady, always ordinary, always the same.
As the 20th century unfolded and drifted slowly toward the world we know today, the homes, foods, and labors of America shifted once more, though never with suddenness when told in this quiet rhythm. For the houses that rose in suburbs after the Second World War stretched gently along streets lined with identical lawns and driveways, each home a modest box of wood, brick, or siding, with living rooms filled by sofas, radios, and later televisions, where families gathered not around the fire alone, but around glowing screens. Yet the rhythm remained familiar, for meals were still placed on tables night after night, simple dishes of meatloaf, potatoes, casseroles, bread, and milk, slowly changing as supermarkets offered cans and boxes, frozen dinners and processed snacks, though in kitchens the sound of pans clinking, kettles whistling, and quiet conversations continued as they always had, and work, though it moved from farms and factories into offices and corporations, still held the same endless repetition, the tapping of typewriters replacing the hum of looms, the shuffling of papers replacing the hammering of nails. Yet each hour stretched, each day repeated, the same arrival at workplaces in the morning, the same weary return home in the evening, while houses themselves filled with new objects. Refrigerators humming, washing machines spinning, radios murmuring, televisions flickering. Yet despite these, the pattern of life remained unbroken. Families rising with alarms, children eating hurried breakfasts, fathers and mothers commuting, evenings closing again with meals, chores, and rest. And in rural places, the old rhythms never disappeared. Barns still filled with hay, fields still demanding planting and harvest, livestock still needing care, the daily circle of labor looping endlessly, while in cities, apartments rose higher, blocks stacked with identical units, kitchens small, hallways narrow, windows looking onto streets filled with cars instead of horses, neon instead of lanterns. But the inside lives were still quiet, meals cooked, clothes mended, bills counted, small conversations exchanged before sleep. And as decades passed, foods grew more diverse, immigration and globalization bringing spices, flavors, and dishes from across the world. Yet the act of eating still remained the same, hands lifting spoons and forks, voices murmuring, plates cleaned, kitchens tidied, and across the land work diversified further, machines and computers humming, offices glowing late, factories automated, yet still humans sat, stood, labored, repeated, lived within routines, and homes themselves filled with comforts, air conditioners humming, carpets soft, couches deep, yet all within the same quiet rhythm, each day passing into the next, each decade into another, until one can step back and see that across centuries, from cabins to suburbs, from hearths to microwaves, from farms to glass towers, the essence of ordinary life has remained a slow unfolding, a layering of sameness, where people always built shelters, always prepared meals, always labored in some form, and always ended days with rest. And in telling this without haste, without drama, it becomes not a story of progress alone, but a lull of continuity, where change drifts like a soft tide, but the rhythm remains unbroken. And so one may picture again the earliest settlers stirring stews over fires, and beside them the factory workers eating bread in dim kitchens, and beside them the office clerks returning to suburban homes for casseroles, and beside them the families of today ordering meals, yet still gathering at tables, all one long procession, all one continuous thread, all the same ordinary persistence of human life, told in such a way that excitement fades, edges blur, voices soften, until history itself becomes like the steady breathing of a sleeper, carrying the listener gently forward, onward, endlessly, without pause, without conclusion, until eyes grow heavy, thoughts slow, and the story, like life itself, continues always, steadily,